Good morning, everyone. And on behalf of the Miramar Pembroke Pines Regional Chamber of Commerce, Western Florida Chamber of Commerce, and Pembroke Park West Park Chamber of Commerce, thanks for joining us for this session of Chamber University. We're going to be going over some really important stuff that anyone who's an employer, has employees, is thinking about getting employees, or maybe you're just an employee yourself and you want to make sure that you know how the rules apply to you. So we're going to be talking about some overtime rules that are coming down the pike and what's going to be new and what's going to change. So today we have our presenter, Lisa Perez with HBL Resources. She has over 30 years experience in HR, and she is on a mission of transforming the human in human resources. She's a USA Today bestselling author, the founder of HBL Resources, the Complete Manager Makeover, National Management Training Week, and she's an approved provider of recertification credits with SHRM and HRCI. She volunteers for the Jim Moran Institute for Broward County's POW program, and she's an executive board member here with the local Chamber of Commerce. She has been recognized with 2 2020 American Business Awards, Silver Stevie Awards for Entrepreneur and Human Resources Professional of the Year. She is originally from Brooklyn, New York. She is a wife, mom, grandma, if you can believe it. I don't. And considers herself a craft geek, which is probably my favorite thing about her. So welcome, Ms. Lisa Perez.
Thank you so much, Angie. I appreciate it. Well, we certainly do have a lot to cover today. I know that there's going to be a recording of this for the Chamber University YouTube channel. But first, a disclaimer, right? We have to realize that human resources changes, Department of Labor regulations change. And so depending on when you're watching this, it may or may not be relevant. So this is intended for general information. It really doesn't constitute any legal opinion or advice. Because the Department of Labor programs can change at a whim, and we are currently recording this on June 18th, 2024. And the regulations we're going to talk about today are changing both in July 1st of 2024, as well as an upcoming change in January the 1st, 2025. So I just need to make sure we put that out there. Please make sure that you use the links and the resources that we'll provide so that you have the up-to-the-minute information as those things change. So let's dive right in. What we're talking about is the FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act. And this is a federal law that establishes minimum wage, overtime pay, record keeping, youth and employment standards, right? Of employees in the private sector, federal, state, local governments, you name it. And the FLSA is enforced by the Wage and Hour Division of the Department of Labor. So we need to understand that all employees are categorized under the FLSA into 2 classifications: exempt and non-exempt. Exempt employees are paid a salary, right, and are not entitled to overtime pay. Non-exempt employees are paid hourly wages and are entitled to overtime pay. So that's the nature of our conversation today. There are some changes in how we pay individuals on a salary basis. And so it's important to understand that distinction up front. The FLSA also allows for certain categories of employees to be salaried and comp time eligible. So we need to understand those distinctions, and we're going to talk about that. But I wanted to kind of paint the big umbrella first. And when we think about the FLSA, that's what I'm going to say for short, right? Once again, it is regulated by the Department of Labor and its Wage and Hour Division. We are having this conversation from a federal level, but because we are based in Florida, we're going to talk about that specifically. It's important for you to know that your state may have its own laws regarding employment classifications, salary basis, as well as hourly pay. But we're talking about this from a federal standpoint for the most part. Be aware of your state laws pertaining to your wage and hour laws in your state, because that could override some of the conversation that we're having today. So let's start with our non-exempt hourly individuals. And this is important to understand because this is, take the journey with me. Okay. So hang tight for me. We're going to talk about the hourly wage, right? The federal minimum wage is $7.25. Most states override that and have a much more generous hourly rate, right? So when we think about non-exempt, that means they are paid hourly and they receive overtime pay. Right now, the Florida state minimum wage as of September 2023, September 30th, is $12 an hour. Now, that is subject to change September 30th of 2024, where our minimum wage will go to $13 an hour. So that is also slated to change on an annual basis until the Florida state minimum wage reaches $15 an hour. Now, back to my disclaimer, there's no way to cover FLSA in an hour. Okay. So all of this is much more expansive from an FLSA Department of Labor perspective. And I'm going to provide some links and resources for you to get further information. But we're just really excerpting pieces out and talking about this from a bullet point standpoint, if you will. But keep in mind after several years, that $15 an hour will be the new minimum wage. And that's been adjusted for inflation. And from a Florida state standpoint, it was part of a constitutional amendment that was approved in 2020. So that's kind of what's happening with the Florida state minimum wage. So let's talk now about exempt employees, right? Our non-exempt employees are eligible for overtime pay. And that overtime pay is 1.5 times their regular rate of pay, right? Per hour for every hour over 40. Okay, that's the basics. So when we think about exempt employees, these individuals are exempt from overtime. We don't pay them overtime pay, but they must be paid their full salary for any week in which they perform any work. And there's really only very few reasons that the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division under the FLSA allows for you to make deductions from that salary. Hopefully we'll have some time to get to some of those, but they must be paid the full salary for every week that they work any part of that, right? So that's where the exemption lives, right? Maybe they work 55 hours. Maybe once they work 35 hours, that hours are subject to change, but the full salary must remain the same. Now, they're not subject to overtime. And again, this is part of that compensation where we have that ability to flex with their hours, but they are required in some situations to use maybe a PTO policy that you have, a vacation or sick policy. And that is one of the permissible things that we can do, right? We can use down a PTO or in a vacation or sick policy that does allow for the shift in that full salary, right? We attribute a day or two to PTO or vacation or sick. But keep in mind, for the most part, you cannot take deductions from that full salary, except with certain exceptions. And we'll get to those. And then, of course, you may have leave time policies. We talked a little bit about this. Exempt employees, they are expected to use their leave time in half-day or full-time increments. It depends on your company policy. And the policy needs to allow for them to be able to take that time to supplement their full salary. Okay, so those are just a few. There's several other reasons you can take, the deduction if you have a bona fide leave plan, i.e. vacation or sick. Now let's talk a little bit about the exemption itself. I think it's important that we make sure, you can't just slap the word manager on a title and say, okay, they're exempt from overtime. That's not how it works, okay? We really need to look at what the position does, how it's treated, how it's paid as well, that would make it subject to the ability to have it classified as exempt from overtime. You don't have to pay overtime. And this really does apply to certain categories of employees. There's an executive category, an administrative category, a professional category, and an outside sales category as well. Now, I am going to provide you with some links so that you can go to the Department of Labor site itself and pull the what they call fact sheets for each of these and how they work. We're going to talk about them in an umbrella, but those are some of the exemptions that you can that do qualify to pay an employee on a salary basis. And then finally, there is a computer employee exemption as well. Now, it's important to, say here that there are tests that need to be passed in order to qualify an employee or a position rather for exemption, right? Which means they're exempt from overtime. You have to look at the salary basis, right? What is the predetermined amount of compensation on a weekly basis, right? We usually use a salary like the annual. There will be some numbers later, so get your calculators ready. And then the salary level as well, and then the job duties. All of these things need to be passed, right? These tests need to be passed in order to qualify a position to be paid on a salary basis or for the exemption. So let's park this a little bit here and talk a little bit in more detail about this. The salary level is just that, the minimum amount that's set by the Department of Labor, and that salary must be paid on a regular basis. We'll use weekly as an example, okay? In addition to that, there's a job duties test. Like I said, you can't just slap the word manager on a title and say, yes, they're exempt from overtime. The employee needs to perform specific duties related to their job and must have a certain level of autonomy, decision-making authority, oversight for other employees. And each of those previously mentioned categories, executive, administrative, sales professional, professional exemption, computer, each of those has a slightly different test. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit what those are. Your executive exemption, yes, you still have to pay them on a salary basis. You have to pay them a certain amount of salary. But in addition to that, the executive exemption, their primary duty needs to be managing the company or managing a department or a division. It's customarily that they are directing the work of at least 2 or more other full-time employees or an equivalent, okay? And then, of course, this worker, right, this executive exemption individual needs to have the authority to hire and fire and make decisions on advancement, promotion of the employees that they supervise. So that's the executive exemption. Most often we see an administrative exemption. The administrative exemption, of course, needs to be paid on a salary basis. The salary rate, the level has to be a certain amount. And then we also have the primary duties as well. And while these are administrative, they're non-manual work. The employee's primary duties includes what the Department of Labor calls exercising discretion and independent judgment. That's a big term to say. They really need to have autonomy when it comes to making decisions and having independent judgment regarding to what's called matters of significance, okay? And there's a huge threshold and criteria that meets that. And those fact sheets will go into that a little bit more. And then the professional exemption, right? Salary basis, salary level, and we're going to get to these salary levels here shortly. The employee's primary duty on the professional exemption requires advanced knowledge, consistent exercise of discretion and judgment, just like that administrative exemption. We most see this with lawyers, right? Things that require more advanced degrees and things of that nature. So you can get an exemption from a professional standpoint. And then there's one for creative professionals, right? This is arts and museums, artistic and creative endeavors, right? Those kinds of things. And then the computer employee exemption, same thing, salary basis, salary level. But the employee also must be employed as a computer systems analyst, a programmer, software engineer, and there's an exemption that's permitted for that. So the final one is an outside sales exemption. If you have someone who is, again, paid on a salary basis, salary level, which we will look at, they also need to have autonomy in business development, obtaining orders, contracts, or services for your company, but they can't be doing it as an order taker, right? They can't be here in the office just taking orders and answering the phone for sales. They need to be outside. That is what part of the criteria for the outside sales exemption is. And then you've got your highly compensated employees, right? Those that are paid, six figures and are exempt, just solely based on that. But they do still have to perform duties, at least one of the duties of an exempt executive, administrative, or professional employee. So you've got that umbrella of the highly paid, but then what other exemption classification do they qualify under? Okay. Now we can go into police and firefighters and paramedics and all those other things, but I'll leave that to the fact sheets for you to review. So let's talk about this salary test. That's really the crux of our conversation today. The salary test says that, right, we've got all the other things, right? Duties of significance, I'm overseeing 2 or more people, all those things. The salary basis is what is changing, or the salary test is what's changing this coming year. Right now, if you have an employee who is exempt from overtime, paid on a salary basis, you must be paying them at least $684 a week. That's an annualized salary of $35,568. Now, this figure is what's changing, right? So your employees may have all the other stuff, right? Duties of significance, maybe they're overseeing 2 or more individuals, all the things. If they are paid less than what it's going to be changing to, you have lost the ability to pay them salary. So here's the upcoming change. The new salary minimum, right, for your exempt worker, your exempt employee, is going to change on July 1st to a minimum salary, we'll just annualize it, of $43,888. But wait, there's more. In January, it's going to go up again. And that new salary threshold, annualized, is going to be $58,656. So you might be thinking to yourself, okay, I've got somebody who right now is over the current minimum. Maybe we'll say they're paid at $40,000. Come July, if you don't increase that salary to $43,888, right? All other things being in compliance to be able to pay them on a salary basis, right? All the other tests that we talked about are passed. This test must also be passed. And so you've got to make that increase in July 1st, and then you've got to make that increase again on January 1st. Well, what if you don't? That individual now becomes non-exempt, and they must be paid on an hourly basis, and they must be paid overtime compensation as well. I'm going to stop there. I did see, I think somebody popped in as well. I want to make sure just at that point, if there's any questions. We've got a lot more to cover, but I wanted to see if there were any questions. I'm looking in the chat, and I see no questions. So all good. All right. So we'll continue. So these salaries are changing for all of the exempt categories that we have. And I invite you to take screenshots. Again, this will be available via recording on the YouTube channel of the Chamber. But these are the new salary thresholds for each of the various positions. You see the standard salary, that's the one we just talked about in the previous slide. You see the total compensation requirements now for the highly compensated employees that I mentioned. The current amount is listed as $107,432. You see that increase July 1 and then again January 1 and the like for the other exemptions. Now, the FLSA does cover Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, the Commonwealth, Northern Marina Islands. So we've added that as well. And then we also have to look at the specific industries, right? You see the computer employees. Remember, I said that's an exemption. Right now, their current amount is $27.63. You see that one is not changing. The computer employees paid on an hourly basis, the compensation is a minimum there. That's the only category at this point that's not changing. So definitely consider those. And again, I will be providing you a fact sheet. So what does this mean for us as employers? Let's take a look at the math. You may want to pull out your calculator. This is where I think we've got to make some determinations in terms of, okay, I've got this employee who's going to be under this amount. What am I going to do? Do I keep that salary and pay them on an hourly basis? Well, you'll have to if you don't increase it, right? But what does that mean in terms of salary? So first, let's start with hours per week. We know that most people work 40 hours per week. That's 52 weeks of the year. And so we look at this 2080, this 2080, as the determining number of hours worked in a year. Okay, so 40 times 52 is 2080. So we use 2080 to determine the hourly rate for an employee. Next, we look at, well, what is that hourly rate for these upcoming changes? Currently at $35,568, your employees, if you created an hourly basis, is $17.10. Come July 1st this year, that will change or needs to change to $21.10. That's based on that annual salary threshold that has just been increased, okay, or that will be increased. So we take that 43,888 divided by the 2080, right, the 2080 hours, and that gives us our hourly rate. And again, in January, that's going to go up one more time. So that new hourly rate for January 1st, 2025 will be $28.20. So what does this mean for that employee who's being paid $40,000 annually? Let's take a look. When you look at the current salary of your employee, let's say you are currently paying someone, as I said before, $40,000. They meet the nature of the exemption because they are over, right, the $35,568 that's required right now, but they're not going to be over in July, right? July, it changes. Right now, their hourly rate based on the $40,000 is $19.23. Let's say that this worker, this individual that's paid $40,000 in your organization generally works maybe 43 hours. Okay. So we take our hourly rate times the first 40 hours, gives us our $769.23. And then our overtime rate, right? Time and a half for the other 3 hours that they work, giving us a compensation of $86.54. When we add this up and annualize it, that new annual rate is $44,500. Now we take that and let's fast forward to what July 1st looks like. At the $44,500, they are going to be over, based on us paying them at an hourly rate, right? They're already going to be over that annual rate that's required. I share this math so that you realize, what do I need to do to figure out, do I make the jump to the 43 or do I continue to pay them hourly, right? This is a numbers situation. Now, I'm going to reiterate, that takes into account the fact that all other tests are passed, allowing for us to take or allowing us to classify rather this employee as exempt from overtime, right? The duties test is passed, how often you're paying is passed. Now the salary level is passed as well. So when we look at this 44,500, okay, if the worker is in fact, working 43 hours on an average, then it would behoove you to either go ahead and make them at the 44.5, right? That would be the right thing to do. Or at the very least, go ahead and increase it to 43,888 now as required by July 1. But we have to do this math again come January, because in January, it changes once again. Okay. So your next steps need to be to do the math. How many hours is your worker being paid? What are they being paid? What does that mean hourly? What is the potential in overtime that they would be paid, right? Based on what they're currently at. And looking ahead at January, what are the salary decisions that you need to make? So I'm going to stop again and see if there are any questions. I'm looking in the chat. Nothing there yet. Any questions for those of you listening out there? Nothing? Yes, Ophelia, please. You can come off mute.
I was typing. Yes,
No worries.
Lisa, great information. But I have a question.
Yes.
Does this increment in salary only applies for minimum wages, or is going to be applied for higher salaries in proportion to the increase of the minimum? Does that make sense?
Reword the question so that I understand.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like, if this incremental, like in July, we're gonna
Yes.
get 43, and then in January to 58. So let's say percentual speaking, we're talking about 15% increase in minimum wages. Does this 15% apply to all salaries across? It doesn't matter if it's minimum wage or only minimum wage.
So these become the new minimum wages for exempt salaried workers in your organization. This is the new minimum that you must pay them if you're paying them on a salary basis. If you're paying them on an hourly basis, the Florida state minimum wage still applies, right? So that $12 an hour that's current, the $13 an hour that's coming up in September, if you're paying your employees on an hourly basis, those remain the minimums.
Okay.
If you are paying workers on a salary basis, these become the new minimums.
Okay.
Right? So that's why we talked about in the beginning, what is this? What is exempt from overtime? What is my hourly? And what is my salary? These determinations are specifically for individuals who you can classify as a salary basis, right?
Okay.
One flat rate for the week, for all hours worked.
Yes.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. My question was more like, for example, like let's say I have employees in the minimum wage and others that are higher, right?
Yep.
So, but if I have to go for the minimum wages one, I have to go to the minimum wage. So it's an incremental in salary. What about the other ones that they were already higher? They're gonna say, oh, you increase salary on them, why you're not increasing salary on
Understood. So what you're talking about is called wage compression, right? What that means is you've got some workers here and some workers here, and what's happening is you're bringing these people up and compressing the range, right? That's what you're talking about.
Exactly.
That's a business decision, right? What we're talking about here is what is the minimums that you have to pay them, but it's your organization, right? You decide whether or not you want to do this, or do this, right? Compress
Got
the wages of those that are lower and bring them up. Those are, there's nothing legal or illegal by keeping these individuals who are already above these thresholds the same, but you've got to realize there is going to be what's called that compression. And yes, that is a result of wage compression. Well, I've been here for 20 years and I didn't get a raise, but they did because of this. You've got to make those business decisions. Great question.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I'll be checking the chat, and feel free to, you know, raise your hand. I am watching that as well. This is the perfect time to have questions. So now let's take a look at some additional next steps. You've got some choices to make. You can either you know, you've got a range of options here. You can increase the salary of the employee to at least a new salary level, right, to retain their exempt status. You can pay an overtime premium of 1.5 times the employee's regular rate of pay for any overtime hours worked, right? Switch them to non-exempt, right? Hourly paid. You can reduce or even eliminate overtime hours, right? And start to say, okay, all work has to be done in 40 hours, right? And adjust your schedules accordingly. How do you ensure that productivity remains the same? You know, all of those kinds of things. These are some serious business decisions we have to make. And then, of course, you can, you know, reduce the amount of pay allocated to the employee's base pay, right? Provided that they still earn at least the hourly minimum wage to offset that new overtime pay. And then, of course, you can use any combination of these. There you go. You can use any combination of these. So when you think about, these are the choices, right? These are the options that you have in your organization. And I highly recommend you take a screenshot of this. These are the things that these are the options. Now, these changes are happening in the next 2 weeks. So if you haven't already started to have some conversations, you may want to start to queue those up to let your team members know, particularly if they're affected by this, right? They're either under, they're over. I've already started to have conversations with several clients who have already begun to have these conversations with their employees and make the adjustments, right? Do the math, like I said, and see what is that going to mean when it comes to new cost of payroll. Okay. And those, again, those are business decisions. In addition to that, I wanted to talk a little bit about exemptions and deductions that might be taken. There are some ways that you can take deductions from salaries. You have to have this in your employee handbook. You have to disclose it to your employees. And we're talking about exempt employees, people that are paid on a salary basis. If you have a you know, salary basis employee, there are permitted deductions, but there are also several from no pay docking, right? You can't dock the pay for absences from work for 1 or full days. Again, if they work the whole week or any portion of the week, they need to be paid that salary basis. Now, if it's sickness or disability, and of course you have, like I said before, a bona fide sickness, vacation policy that they can, you know, draw from for those types of absences, you can make that deduction because they're paid out by PTO, or maybe they've exhausted all of that sick or vacation time in that bona fide plan, and then you can make the deduction as well, but far and few between. So definitely get consultation about that for a case-by-case basis. And then, of course, you can use it to offset jury fees, witness pays. Most of the time, the math isn't even worth the math, and you just keep the salary the same. But those are things that can, be considered. And then, again, you can do things for violation of safety rules, things of major significance. So those, again, are permitted. And then, of course, any unpaid disciplinary suspensions. I think in my 30 years, I've probably seen this happen twice and had permitted the deduction twice for disciplinary suspensions. I'm not a user of that policy, right? Suspensions aren't a slap in the wrist, right? They should be more progressive corrective action step, but that's another seminar. And so when we think about, the portion of an employee's salary that can be deducted, we've got to be very careful to make sure that they fall within the guidelines of the Department of Labor. So I'm going to share a couple of resources with you now in our membership. Let me pull some of these links. Of course, my links aren't linking. Let me grab this really quick. And of course, I can't find it. So let me go ahead and put that in the chat. Let me actually take this. Microsoft Word is shutting down as we speak. So that's where I had all my links. Here we go. Sorry about that. Couple of technical difficulties. Okay, so in your chat window is the link for the fact sheets. So what are you going to find when you look at the fact sheets? What you're going to see in the fact sheets are all of the details that I just shared in terms of the various classifications and their respective exemptions. The administrative exemption, the highly paid, the professional, right? All of those exemptions, as well as the great detail of how you can allow the exemption, right? How do you classify an employee? What are the tests? What are the duties? What is the criteria you need to ensure you meet to allow the exempt employee to work under a salary basis? Again, you can't just say, oh, I titled the manager. It's a lot more than that. And those rules are becoming much more restrictive with these upcoming changes. It's not just that salary threshold. And then I'm going to share with you this frequently asked question as well. I put that in the chat as well, so that you can take a look at that in terms of, you might be asking yourselves various questions. And these are all things that have been vetted, that organizations are asking, that business owners have asked. And so the Department of Labor has provided a frequently asked questions. Now, I also have a cheat sheet for you, key provisions from the Department of Labor. It's a PDF. I'll put that in the chat as well. I don't know how you would do that in on the YouTube channel. Maybe there's files or what have you, but anyone can email me at lisa@hblresources.com, and I'll be more than happy to get that information to you. However, this particular document comes from our membership. We offer a human resources support and training subscription service for small businesses. And this is one of the documents that are available as part of that membership. So these key provisions from the Department of Labor, this white collar exemption, right? All of the information that we cover and then some are available to you in that PDF. So let me give you my contact information so that we can continue the conversation in the event you want to reach out. I'm going to go ahead as well and open it up to any questions that you have at this moment. And, again, I'm available to chat. This is the QR code where you can find me on LinkedIn. We can continue the conversation. You can reach out for further information. Definitely reach out if you want that PDF that goes through the key provisions. It's kind of everything we just talked about in a couple of pages, but also provides links and resources directly to the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division relating to this topic of FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and how these exemptions are going to be changing going forward. So it certainly has been a pleasure to present this. I could go on and on with this for hours and hours. So we've really just taken key pieces of this puzzle to give you the information that you need to start to discuss with your team members, make some important business decisions so that going forward, come July 1 and then again January 1, you're in compliance and not subject to potential litigation or claims for back wages as a result of not making someone hourly when they should have otherwise been hourly at those points. So, Angie, any questions? I don't see anything in the chat. I invite anybody who's on the call as well to ask me any questions.
No, amazing stuff. Amazing stuff. I think that definitely the key takeaway here, first and foremost, is that most of us are probably in our last pay period before these changes
That's
are going to
correct.
take effect July 1.
Yes.
So if you have a minute, now, or, maybe while you grab your lunch today,
Yeah.
I would say start looking at, your employee, your payroll list, and make sure, click the links that Lisa has provided in the chat. I think
Yeah.
those will be really important to review those exemptions and see if anybody falls in there or doesn't,
Right.
and then what we would have to do from that point. So super important. And then if you can, if you're okay for July 1st, great. Take a beat, and now
Yep.
you've got the next 6 months to figure out what you're going to do with anybody else that would then at that point, January 1,
Exactly.
qualify for these things. So super, super important. I don't think any of us want to run afoul of Labor Department
Definitely
or
not that one.
ourselves to have to
Yeah.
open up our books and prove that we're not stiffing anyone on their pay.
Exactly.
So, not a good place to be.
Exactly. And back wages, right? I've had situations in previous years, right, where the minimum wage goes up and you forget, you're subject, you could be subject to back wages up to 3 years, right?
Oh my
Now,
goodness, yeah.
obviously these changes happen July 1 and then January 1, but if you extend it and don't do what you need to do, that number could add up pretty significantly,
It sure can.
especially
And
for our
then,
small business community.
you'd have to think also, you'd probably have to submit amended, payroll reports,
Oh, yes.
941s and all
Yep.
that.
Yep.
And submitting amendments, I know is never a good thing.
Yeah.
My understanding is that it puts up red flags.
Exactly.
So we don't want that for any of you.
Exactly.
So definitely keep that in mind. If you have any questions, you can definitely reach out to Lisa. I know she is here at the chamber, our go-to HR pal. So she knows all of the things. But these are really great resources. We will share them via email to anyone that was registered today.
Perfect.
I could also put them, I'll put them in the description down below in the YouTube video, so you can see those as well, while keeping in mind, like Lisa said at the beginning, that these are very timely documents that may change
Yes.
over time. So always
Yes.
make sure you're referring back to the U.S. Department of Labor website to make sure that you are doing the right thing at the right time.
Absolutely. And that PDF has links directly to the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division. So always go directly to the source.
Awesome. Wonderful. Lisa, thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions at this point? We good? Awesome. Again, if you do, you can reach out to Lisa and we'll all go from there. Thank you all so much for joining us. I so much appreciate it. And again, as always, if anyone has ideas for future Chamber University topics, please reach out to us at the Chamber. We're happy to find an expert in the field that you need to get you the resources you're looking for. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Bye.
Bye.